And we are live, coming to you from the glitz of, well, actually, no, it's the greyness of London, it's the communism of Tashkent, and it's the sunniness of Cyprus. I'm not entirely sure whether my guests will agree with my introduction there, but my name's Piotr. Some of you who are regulars, welcome. We're joined by Professor Michael Rossi and Professor James Ker-Lindsay for a three-way conversation, not an interview, so we're going to be interrupting one another probably at incremental times. But gentlemen, thank you very much as usual. Nice to have us back after a couple of weeks away, and I'm sort of, this is an open-ended question for both of you, I think, to kick off, but like, seems like it's been slightly less hectic than the past couple of weeks, right? After the fiasco of the White House, it seems like we've seen a little bit more calming. We've seen Kursk, obviously, but I don't know. How do you feel about the latest set of events around Ukraine and Europe?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, welcome back to the, what was it that it was called 2 weeks ago? Two centrists and the Marxist guy.
No, I think two liberals and the Marxists.
Two liberals and
Marxists. In that American pejorative term, right. Liberal.
Two liberals and the Marxist guys. So,
same thing for many, sort of, but on our side of the Atlantic, obviously it is quite different. But for many Americans, two libs and a Marxist, that's...
You're right. I mean, so I'm glad.
Basically, in American, in MAGA terms, it's we're all communists. Basically, in MAGA terms, we're all Marxists. No
basically, yes.
Sorry, Mike.
No, that's fine. I'm actually kind of glad. I'm actually kind of glad that things kind of sort of calmed down for a little bit, just because I didn't miss anything last week when I was traipsing through the Caucasus in Georgia and Armenia. But I think that the brouhaha that came out of the White House, spat between Zelensky, Trump, and Vance. If I'm not mistaken, it was a couple of days ago where Zelensky had now apologized to Trump, for being out of character, for being disrespectful, effectively giving Vance what he wanted. And is a way sort of reaching out to the United States to really push for this 30-day ceasefire. Now, whether that is because he realizes that he's not getting what he used to get from the United States in terms of Europe, or whether the European leaders are also pushing for a 30-day ceasefire, is really something that only he knows. But I think right now everyone seems to be waiting for Russia to sign on to this proposal, and both Putin and Lavrov have said that they are, in theory, happy to sign on to anything that leads to concrete results. It's not just a simple time out for 30 days. But if it gets to the underlying issues of what caused the conflict in the first place, then they're willing to play ball.
James?
I was thinking the same thing. Is it that things are really calmer, or is that we have just become so immune now to everything that's going on that this was a relatively quieter week? And that maybe that's that sort of, which says all sorts of things about how the world has changed, and it has only been about 6 weeks that we've been in this situation. So, but yeah, certainly on ceasefire, it was very interesting. I mean, there was a lot of commentary in the media and reporting it generally incorrectly. That Russia had signed up to a ceasefire agreement, or had accepted a ceasefire agreement. But of course, that wasn't what has happened at all. I mean, what we have simply seen is that, Putin is smart enough to know not to say no immediately to Trump, but just simply put him in a holding pattern and make the right noises and say, but of course, there's all sorts of things that have got to be discussed and thought about. And I know that you want to talk about Kursk, and that clearly is something that is very much on the Russian minds of, before we sign up to any ceasefire, which could well, we're talking about a 30-day ceasefire, but I think, the overall intention is then to have that roll over and effectively become a permanent ceasefire, that Russia will want to make sure, it can gain as much territory as it can before then.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was listening to a very apt podcast with Dr. Fiona Hill, who I'm sure you both know well. She's the former DNS for the US on European matters and Russia. And, you know, she's been very accurate, I think, in a lot of her analysis in the past several years. And I mean, she summed it up well. As with a lot of these things, I've been unable, I think, to articulate the thoughts in my head. Sometimes you need a third person to do it for you. And she said it simply that none of what Trump has done or what is happening right now is necessarily a surprise. We knew that it was coming, that he would want to disengage from Europe, that he'd want to reduce American input in a lot of different places apart from maybe Indo-Pacific and China. But it's the rate, it's the pace at which these things are unraveling, and the what's the word for the overlappingness, like it's all happening at once. Every day he seems to pick a new fight or reignite one, right? So he had mentioned Panama for say a month, and suddenly then he's like, oh well, we're going to do something over Panama, and sort of reignite that discussion over the war of 91 or whenever, 89, with H.W. Bush, you know, the invasion that they did back then, sort of sentiments. So I do think and that sort of leads me into another point which I wanted to make personally, which was, I know last time we had our three-way chat, I was a little bit hot-headed with James particularly, and some of you in the comments thought I was a little bit standoffish, which I think is partially but I want to acknowledge that partially, not because I'm trying to be a rude ass to either of these esteemed guests and colleagues, but because I think it's a sense of helplessness, a sense of annoyance and frustration that we are seeing so many things that we've taken for granted in terms of, you know, peace and international law and the order that we appreciate being unraveled before our eyes, and we can't do anything about it. And there's so many people who, be it on X or other places, deliberately evoke these sentiments of disinformation, Russian propaganda, and we know it's rubbish. People who study it and work in it professionally, as you guys do, we know how bad it is, and it's just a shame. So I think that's where I come of it, more from a passion than a sort of a rudeness. But I was kind of interested for your perspective, Michael, since you were visiting two countries that have obviously been heavily influenced by Russian influence or interference or whatever. What are the sentiments there from people on the ground, what they're seeing occurring in Europe and Ukraine and US?
You know, I mean, you know, I was there, just so everybody knows, on pleasure, not necessarily just business. So, you know, I was there as a tourist, just traveling through Yerevan, Tbilisi, Gori, among others. And I know that within Georgia, there's this assumption in the West that this is a country that is eager to get into the EU, to get into NATO. There have been protests. There are still daily protests, you know, in Tbilisi, although they tend to be, you know, more or less performative at this point. I mean, nothing in comparison.
Is that over Article 13, or the idea of an Article 13 like what Russia did a few years ago? I forget the name of it.
No, it's not that. It's simply now, it's just kind of morphed into a general sense of frustration with a government that many people see is heavily under the influence of Moscow. So it's nothing in specific anymore. The government is very much pro-Moscow, the public sort of half-half. Ironically enough, the only thing that I found in Tbilisi that outnumbered the amount of EU and NATO flags were Russians that were there, living there, being as tourists. And I mean, they are frequenting the restaurants, they're frequenting the hotel. I mean, you know, Tbilisi is heavily reliant now on the tourism industry, and Russians make up more than 50% of that. You find Americans, you find Japanese, you find everybody there. But I mean, Russian is wide. And the ironic thing about this is that all the signs, all the official signs in Tbilisi are either in Georgian and English. That's it. And yet, in the restaurants and in the hotels, everything is also in Russian, and everybody has to be able to speak Russian if they want to work there. So it's sort of an uneasy relationship, but I mean, we're not going to get political as far as tourists are concerned. In Yerevan, Armenia, I mean, Russian is just ubiquitously spoken. It is not as displayed, you know, on street signs. I mean, everything is in Armenian, but you know, the overwhelming population speaks Russian. The locals there also will speak Russian to each other as well. So the politics, especially I was surprised in Yerevan. I only saw just a couple of things related to the, you know, fiasco in Karabakh. But other than that, Yerevan is a completely enclosed city operating on its own vibe and its own speed. Tbilisi is
Can I
still
ask you a
very
couple of follow-ups on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm kind of curious. No, I'm curious because I haven't been to that region yet, unfortunately. But this is obviously happening at a time, I'm sure you both saw in the news, the relatively overlooked, because of everything else going on, the ceasefire agreement or long-term arrangement agreement between the Azerbaijanis and Armenians, which is huge. And that's sort of for you, Michael, because Russia obviously was supposed to come to the aid of Armenia when Azerbaijan took Nagorno-Karabakh and pushed out 250,000 ethnic Armenians from that area. So how do they feel about sort of being betrayed effectively by the Kremlin? And
it's difficult to say. I mean, I really don't want to get into conversations. I mean, there's a few colleagues of mine that I knew, and I was comfortable enough to bring this up. And the general understanding, the general way of looking at all of this really falls into one of two categories. One group is that it was primarily Pashinyan's fault, who just threw Karabakh under the bus. And whether or not he had intended to just get rid of this piece of territory that he knew he could not keep, it could have been done with better diplomacy. And the other half, just looks at this and says that it's just the latest in the long saga of Armenians being expelled from areas outside of Armenia today, whether it's in Turkey or whether it's in Azerbaijan. But the sense that it was Russia's fault, I did not hear. And maybe it's just simply because of the people that I spoke to. But the real responsibility for this is Pashinyan, who seems to not know how to play any of the cards that have been dealt with him, because as far as the Russian side was concerned, is that the proposed agreement before the counter-offensive a couple of years ago was that Armenia held about 7 regions within the larger Karabakh-Artsakh area. 2 of those were of the original Karabakh Oblast, and 5 surrounding regions kind of just added all to the larger territory, with the idea that if Armenia, and by extension Karabakh, negotiates by giving back the 5 territories that it had taken, which have been largely depopulated, in exchange for keeping some kind of autonomy, some kind of joint administration of the original Karabakh Oblast, Aliyev would have signed off on that. Right. He would have absolutely have signed off on that. And that was Russia's proposal from the start. They had never said that they were recognizing the independence of Karabakh. They always recognized Azerbaijan within its 1991 borders. When Pashinyan, and I think at this point this was March of 23, if I'm not mistaken, had said at some European/NATO security meeting in, I think it was Prague, that he recognizes that Karabakh's future lies within the sovereign authority of Azerbaijan. That was a green light for Aliyev, who said, okay, then we don't need to do anything. Even Russia was kind of looking at him like, are you nuts? I mean, you're literally giving up your leverage here. To which Russia was like, okay, well, if you're fine with this, then we're not getting involved. We're not getting involved. So what we need to now think of is, what is the agreement going to look like? Will there be a return of Armenians to the Karabakh region? Or once you're displaced, you don't really tend to go back? The Armenians that were there have all said that Karabakh, Stepanakert, was a beautiful nature preserve, right? Almost like completely different from that of Yerevan, right? So, the food is better, the fruit is better, the water is better. It was a great place to be, and it was a horrible loss that this whole thing had happened. Whether there is going to be a return to the population, some kind of, joint diplomatic recognition, this is primarily up to Pashinyan and Aliyev. But right now, Aliyev holds not only all the good cards, Aliyev holds the freaking deck.
He holds the freaking deck. I mean, I wouldn't discount also, obviously, China, two nations, one state, as I think they've called it, right, in the past, the former president of Azerbaijan or leader. But James, I mean, I'm sure you're itching.
I've got quite a different take on this to no, for all sorts of reasons. Partly because I know Armenia very well. I go a couple of times each year. And so I, had a lot of chances to talk to people. I actually am a great admirer of Pashinyan. I think, he was dealt an awful deck. And you're right, Michael. I completely agree that Aliyev controls the situation, and Pashinyan knows that. The trouble is that Armenia was a country in deep denial about what was happening. It had won the war in the early 1990s, and it had become very complacent about its position. And yet we have known for a long time before the war that Azerbaijan was steadily building up its armaments to an extent that there were certain years where the Azerbaijani military budget was greater than the entire Armenian state budget. But most Armenians, and certainly most of the opposition political leaders who'd essentially driven the Armenian policy for a very long time, absolutely refused to level with the Armenian people about this. They pretended that this could continue, that nothing was wrong. I would posit that Armenia probably knew that it had lost Karabakh in 2015, if not before then. With the way that the military spending was going, they knew they couldn't win this. They could have cut a deal. They didn't. I don't know really what Pashinyan could have done. He couldn't have gone to the people and said, look, I'm going to sign off on a deal which will return Karabakh or Artsakh, as they know it, to Azerbaijani control. That would have had him strung up as a traitor. I think, unfortunately, he just knew it was going to have to play out in a particular way. And try and minimize that. And I think, he has all credit. I think he's been an amazing peacemaker given the hand that he was dealt. And you're absolutely right on that. I don't disagree. I think Aliyev was just in an absolutely unbelievably strong position. And as you said, I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see the nuts and bolts of the peace agreement. Azerbaijan was pushing for very, very punitive terms. It will be interesting to see whether any Armenians are permitted to return. I suspect that if they are, it will be under a condition that they have to accept Azerbaijani control. No talk of autonomy or self-determination or any of that. If you want to go back to Stepanakert or to Nagorno-Karabakh, you do so as Azerbaijani citizens. No special conditions, no local autonomy or self-government government or anything like that. And that I think is probably going to be the best outcome that we could expect from this. But there is also questions to do with their border. They've already reached a few agreements on handing over certain villages and things, and in order to draw out the line, essentially what I think Pashinyan is now looking for is to finally, once and for all, settle that relationship with Azerbaijan, make sure that the issue of Karabakh is dealt with, make sure that the border is agreed so there's not going to be any more border skirmishes. One of the other things that are going to be really important to look out for is the transport link across Armenia from eastern Azerbaijan to Nakhchivan, which is incredibly important because if anyone looks at the map, from Nakhchivan, you could just quickly pop up and get into Turkey. And so essentially what this does is create a Turkic line, transport corridor running all the way from essentially from Thrace right over to Central Asia. And this is something that, I think Erdogan is extremely keen to see. So it's an interesting, long, just a long overview, but I sort of am a little bit more sympathetic, I think, towards Pashinyan than Michael. One other thing I would just quickly say is on the Russia angle. You're right. There are a lot of Russians that you see in Yerevan. Essentially, Yerevan is one of the four routes that Russians can get back into Russia from in Europe. So Belgrade is one, Istanbul is another, and Yerevan is another. And I'm just trying to remember which is the fourth. There is one more. But essentially, any Russians wanting to come and go from Russia these days into Europe are effectively going through those four places. Somebody maybe in the comments can remind me what the fourth one is. I'm tempted to say Hungary, but I think Hungary has got the air restrictions in place. But certainly Serbia, Turkey, and Armenia don't.
I think
Georgia.
Georgia might. Yeah, right? You're right. Maybe.
Yeah. We saw the countless, should we say, exit flows, outflows of Russians when the partial mobilization by the Kremlin was instigated in late 2022, and you saw tailbacks of several miles of Russians trying to get into Georgia and generally the broader Caucasus. I think that a lot of what you guys have said is, well, I certainly defer to your greater knowledge of this region than mine, but I think it's quite interesting to see how Turkey capitalizes on all of this in the broader geopolitical framework, because obviously we've got Syria now. There's lots of discussion about some kind of new Syrian pipeline from an energy security standpoint, and so if Turkey can capitalize on both of those areas, they really control a lot of energy security towards Eastern Europe. And given to tie it back into what we've framed the conversation around Europe going it alone, I think there was, I don't know, James, correct me if I'm wrong, but I got the sense that in the later 2010s there was more hope that Europe would be willing to support Armenia's democratization process and protect them more. But given their focus now towards their own, should we say, near abroad and Ukraine is the sort of strategic priority, I feel like Armenia's had to play the best hand it has, which is not much at all. They don't have the deck, as Michael says, and they've sort of basically just had to cut their losses and accept that they're surrounded by much more stronger ties of Azerbaijan. Russia's not going to protect them, the EU's not going to do anything. So I feel sorry for Armenia. They feel like a small state in the middle.
Piotr, you're right. I mean, it's in a fascinating position, and I often have this conversation when I am in Yerevan, because, of course, you've got Georgia, which applied for EU membership, but obviously that's been hauled under the waterline at the moment. I mean, hopefully we would maybe see that renewed. But Armenia hasn't taken that step as yet. And I think there's, I find it really interesting. I think on several levels. I think I often say I feel there's a lack of confidence in Armenia about EU membership, that many Armenians don't actually understand, or not, I wouldn't say understand, don't think that Europe would be terribly welcoming if they did put in an application. Whereas in actual fact, I mean, the interesting thing is, I think that many Europeans would be incredibly positive towards an Armenian application. I mean, especially a country like France, it's got a large Armenian population, very strong relations traditionally with Armenia. I think that a lot of Europeans would be, and I think it goes, for better or for worse, that it probably goes without saying that Europeans are far more positively disposed to Georgian and Armenian membership than they ever were towards Turkish membership, for all the obvious reasons that we can talk about. But I don't pick up the sense that Armenia had the confidence to go in that direction. I think one of the really interesting things, of course, that we're in at the moment is, and it's an incredible conversation to be having, is that what about NATO? That the Armenians had, I think, been slowly making a strategic shift towards the West. I think that was one of the things that Pashinyan was trying to do. They were treading very carefully. They've still got Russian bases in Armenia, but they were very let down during the Nagorno-Karabakh war. They felt that Russia should have stepped in earlier to save Karabakh, and literally Moscow only intervened if it had left it even 5 or 6 hours later, then Azerbaijan would have overrun Karabakh, and that was in the original war, not the later on when that's exactly what Azerbaijan did. And even then, many Armenians felt profoundly let down, and I think that started the ball rolling. But of course, now with way that everything's going, way that Trump is talking up about relations with Putin, I would imagine it'll be fascinating when I next go to Yerevan, what the conversations people are having there about it, because I think this will make them really nervous. They were ready to start making that move away, more closely aligning with the West. But now they're seeing this, it will be, I think they will feel incredibly squeezed at the moment.
Yeah, I was just going to add a couple of points on the sort of broader EU accession process, right? Because it's incredibly complicated, and you've got countries in various stages, mainly in the Balkans, that have been, well, Turkey's been, as you say, in negotiations for what, 40 years or something like that. Montenegro and Serbia both in the negotiations phase. Then you've got Albania and North Macedonia, which I still think are in candidate status, and then you've got Bosnia, which has submitted its application, but it hasn't yet been granted candidate status, right? And that's why Moldova and Ukraine were quite notable, because they were fast-tracked in both NATO and EU senses. So I think of all the countries that have finished, because you have to go through the chapters, right? The various different chapters of the EU protocols. I think the one that's making the most amount of headway is North Macedonia at the moment. I can't see Georgia or Armenia getting that sort of process yet. And I think with the, again, broad geostrategic situation for what it is, any sort of ascension talks are going to be put on hold until some kind of stability is established around Ukraine and the ceasefire and stuff. So, and on that pivot, see how smooth pivot that was. I was kind of curious to hear from you guys what you thought about the ceasefire back and forth. I don't know, general developments over Ukraine this week, because it's obviously been pretty crazy. And then we can go into the broader European security stuff and the main focus of the video conversation. I don't know, Michael, if you wanted to, where do you see it? How do you feel about it?
Well, I mean, as I had said in the beginning, Putin's response is he's receptive to the idea. And the official statement from Russia has been, since the outbreak of the war, that they have never shied away. They have never turned down an opportunity to negotiate. The problem is that every time that they do, and this is the Russian narrative, either some wretched former prime minister of the UK steps in and tells Zelensky not to sign. We're looking at you, Bojo. Or there is a signature, but there's no implementation. So for Russia, they want something more concrete than the Istanbul agreements, which were scuttled, the Minsk agreements, which were absolutely abandoned. And if you go back to the speech that Putin made the night of the launch of the special military operation, and it's
the
on
war.
my YouTube.
Come on, let's call it the war.
Yes, I just, whatever you want to call it, the war, the disagree, whatever it is. Sure, the war.
Both me and James's look as he said that. Like I was just Sorry, Michael.
So the outbreak of the war, fine, But Putin had referred to the United States as the so-called empire of lies. And he hasn't said that statement since. The empire of lies, and shameless plug for my page, go on to the one, it's the one with 3 million views. That's what, made my page viral. But this statement is largely predicated on the idea that the West cannot be trusted. And that even though they are pushing for a ceasefire, the ceasefire, according to Russia's interpretation, is simply to give Ukraine enough breathing room to regroup, rearm, recoup your losses, and then fight again. So if there is going to be a ceasefire, there should not be anything that is, it's not a 30-day thing. It should be a permanent ceasefire. And there should be no international peacekeepers on Ukrainian territory. There should be a red line item that says no, NATO membership for Ukraine. And that is what they will sign on to. And if they don't, then we play the waiting game and see what happens.
Wow.
I mean, look, both sides are going to be making the same calculation about territory. That essentially what we all believe, and with good reason in this situation, is that when that's, as I said right at the start, I mean, when that ceasefire comes into force, there will be an expectation that that could well be the defined line that will be accepted, not in a legal sense, and I think that that's a whole thing that we need to also address. But it would essentially sort of freeze things along that line. That will be the expectation. So I'm sure Kiev and Moscow are both thinking at the moment very, very clearly about what that ceasefire could well mean in terms of, you know, bolstering forces and drawing it. I think it's very clear that there is absolutely no way that Putin wants to be drawing a ceasefire with any Ukrainian troops on Russian soil. That much is very obvious, and it's been sort of quite noticeable, hasn't it, that, you know, Russia has clearly diverted its troops to Kursk to try and achieve that, even if it does mean that it's going to be losing a little bit more territory that it held in Ukraine, simply because it doesn't. I mean, in some ways, it then becomes an obvious bargaining point for any possible future peace agreement. Although I am more of the view that we're probably talking about a permanent ceasefire rather than a peace agreement, even further down the road. I would imagine part of me thinks that a peace agreement is something that we could potentially be talking about in a decade, 2 decades time, or not at all. I mean, I think there's the most likely outcome from all of this is that, you know, what we will see in eastern Ukraine is a parallel to what we've seen in Transnistria, what we've seen in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. That, you know, it will be a frozen conflict. It's essentially.
Yes, it's a frozen conflict.
I think it's to sort of add my 2 cents. I think that, well, the first thing I'd say is sort of there's a distinction between this, as we said before, there's what we prefer, and there's more of the reality of how things are going right now. I've often refrained from sharing some of my opinions because I have my Russian background, and so I immediately villainized as some kind of pro-Kremlinite because I'm like, well, the reality of the situation is not ideal, but simply I cannot see realistically how Ukraine in its current circumstances can reclaim the territories that Russia control. They are deeply embedded there. They are well entrenched physically, literally, and it just looks incredibly unlikely that anything like that is going to change. Maybe it makes more sense, and again, this is not my preference, is for Ukraine to engage in some kind of ceasefire, but arm itself to the teeth. Now we're seeing, obviously, any MAGA or grifters on Twitter, for example, who are incredibly, accusing Europe now. It's not just America anymore. It's now just Europe as being the provocators for World War III, because we're discussing the idea of peacekeepers, some kind of security deterrence. But the point is they always leave out the critical bit of information, which is only in a ceasefire scenario. So now people don't like the fact that Europe is waking up. Europe is taking its initiative and wanting to, defend the sovereignty of another state in a way that America doesn't want to. And I think it's very revealing that the goalposts keep moving as soon as the framework around Trump and his relationship with Putin and wanting to normalize ties there is now making people criticize Europe as being the warmongers when they've mainly only focused on the US. So I think it's quite interesting like that. But yeah, I just don't see it realistically being the case. And the Russians are never going to relinquish their demand for these maximalist goals. Well, the flurry of this conversation we saw about the ceasefire largely ended in, well, it was jack shit that changed. Putin simply just took back Kursk. And that's the biggest change. Other than that, though, what's different? Putin's demanding the same. The US is considering different tactics. Ukraine doesn't want to flinch, negotiate on those regards. So the actual likelihood of some kind of ceasefire, really, I'm not sure. I mean, there is this idea of this truce, a 30-day truce, which is only in the air and the sky and maritime, but they continue warring on the battlefield. But I don't feel like Trump administration is particularly interested in that. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I mean, Trump is looking for a victory. He's looking for something that he can, stick to his legacy. I mean, this is ultimately what he wants. He's driven by ego more so than policy. I mean, I don't think none of us here will disagree with that. So he wants something that sticks. Putin is giving, as I've said, a tepid response to this, but he's willing to talk to Trump, And they're willing to basically just ignore Europe entirely. Starmer is putting together his so-called coalition of the willing. I don't have that much faith that Keir Starmer is that much of an international leader in that sense, but he's going to try. Europe is going to try. So
if I can disagree with you there, I think Sakir is actually surprised us a little bit, Michael. Sorry, I want to let's spice it up with a little bit of a debate, right?
But I mean, I'm sorry. There's nothing. There's really nothing to spice up. I mean, there's not.
Well, no, he's not a spicy character.
There's nothing spicy about British food. So
hey, the national dish is chicken tikka masala. That's the national dish of the UK. That's Indian.
Thank God, finally. It's the thing. Last time I was in London, the best thing I do is just go out for Indian food. So, in any event, I mean, Russia just seems to largely be ignoring Europe's little, cosplay diplomacy. And I think that he can afford to ignore it because he sees that the ultimate negotiator is with Trump. And if they do agree to something and Europe continues to push the envelope for defending Ukraine, well, have at it. Let's see. I'm hearing.
I would take a different view. I think Putin is trying to write the Europeans out because he's ultimately afraid of Europe. I mean, listen, Europe has been disorganized, but if it does get its act together, it's not something to be sniffed at. I mean, we talk very much about how Europe has been buying very much from American arms and things like that. But don't forget, there is a very significant European arms industry as well. And it produces some very, very good technology. And if Europe starts splashing all that cash in that direction and starts taking its own responsibility for its own security, as many are now arguing that it has to, and this is where I have to say, I think Trump has made the most monumental mistake of any US president, in that he's listened to what other US presidents have said and not understood that what they said and what they meant were two fundamentally different things. So you've had US presidents moaning for years and years and years about Europe not taking responsibility for its own security and it needs to spend more. But in actual fact, every single prior US administration, apart from Trump 1, loved that. That was absolutely perfect for them. As people have been noting, Europe effectively became a US protectorate. Trump, on the other hand, took that in, heard it, internalized it. They're ripping us off because everything in Trump world is about being ripped off. And now saying to the Europeans, and he's just driving Europeans away. And once they get their act together and they stop spending on US arms and start saying, right, okay, we will defend ourselves. And it is a really interesting debate that's emerging on all of this. I just did an interview with one of the newspapers here to talk about, where Europe is coming together and the debate about involving Turkey. And this has been a really, really fascinating development. That in recent years, there's been a lot of suspicion about Turkey, and with good reason. It hasn't been seen as a good NATO player. But I'm really getting the sense, like many other observers, that Ankara is really nervous about what's happening between the United States and Russia. It plays two games with Russia, but essentially it's always been very nervous about Russian imperial expansion, about Russia's place in the Black Sea. And now it sees that maybe Washington's tying up with the Russians, that it now wants to be very much in on the European Act. And you involve a country like Turkey, the European Union also brings in other NATO members who aren't EU members. You get the Norwegians involved, you get the British involved, even Iceland, which doesn't have an armed force, but is very important for North Atlantic. But it's absolutely vital for North Atlantic security because it provides that. I know, we laugh at little Iceland, which doesn't have a military.
I'm not laughing. No, it's a very astute point. They only
absolutely
have
and maybe even the Canadians. Then you're talking a NATO minus the United States. Yes, it's a big shift. There's no doubt about it. But Europe is still a major, and it's got a bigger population than the United States. It's a bigger economy.
I want to add 1 cent to you, James, and then I know Michael's itching to pound to balance or whatever, but I just want to echo a couple of things because I think that this is so important. those who idolize Trump, I mean, you've even made me get out a pen and paper, right, guys? I'm writing shit down now. People who idolize Trump or are Putin apologistic they just don't like the fact that Europe is not willing to lie down and take it, right? Europe is wanting to stand up. And that's why I do differ with you, Michael, when you say that Europe is not important to Putin. Putin's been quite vocal, I think, from what I've seen, about, you know, he doesn't like the fact that the Europeans are willing to put soldiers or peacekeepers or whatever on the in a ceasefire scenario. So I think Putin's frustrated that Europe is being more independent in its thinking now, and being a fly in the ointment, right? It's being a spanner in the works to his grand strategic plan of improving relations with Washington and being reintegrated to a certain extent. And whilst this is maybe, you know, not as big a deal because Europe doesn't have that military capacity yet, I still think that they will eventually. It depends. I think the biggest factor here is time. As we said already, you know, Ukraine wants security, America wants a ceasefire, Russia wants time, but not in the way that Europe needs time. Russia wants time to win strategically and militarily, whilst the Europeans need time to militarize to counterbalance against the Russians because of the unpredictability of Trump's administration. I don't know. You just don't think it's Europe's relevant in this case?
I have a difficult time trying to point where Europe is and who speaks on behalf of Europe. See, we're talking about the United States as one country. We're talking about Russia.
No, I agree.
Europe is a 27-headed hydra. And let's be perfectly honest here. Out of the 27 heads, there's maybe about 5 that really count. And they're all democracies. And democracies can change trajectory with every election. You just talked about Turkey before. That's not going to happen under an AKP government. That will not happen as long as Erdogan is alive.
What won't happen?
Turkey gravitating more towards Europe. If there is elections and Erdogan, you know, retires, AK party is not popular. It is not popular in Turkey, but they keep winning because the opposition remains divided. Let's say that if there is a scenario in which, you know, CHP wins, the Kemalists win, and we have a reformer. Let's say we have Ekrem İmamoğlu, who becomes the president of Turkey. That I could see. That's a possibility. That could be a way of having Turkey re-engage with Europe. When we also talk about arming Europe for Ukraine, I also heard about the possibility of reintroducing mandatory conscription into the armies. There seems to be a disconnect between the political leadership that still thinks it's the 1990s and the population, which is asking why. Why do we have to fight this? And when elections happen and the anger is gravitated towards national populist parties that are against this type of neoliberal engagement, that's where I say, look, if in 5 years or so your scenario plays out, I stand corrected. But right now, there are still too many elements within the larger European collectivity, the larger European confederation, that could be any one obstacle towards making this reality happen. I mean, I'm
Viktor Orban is one clear figure, but no, I mean, I think on Turkey, look, I mean, you know, if you're talking about Turkey joining the European Union, I mean, that's clearly off the table for the moment. Erdogan blows hot and cold on this at a performative level. He's recently been talking more about EU membership again. I don't think he wants EU membership. I just don't think he ever wants to tell the Turkish people that it's off the table because he knows it would be incredibly unpopular. So it's an interesting game that's played. But I think that the thing to recognize is that for many European leaders, we are now talking about a changed security environment. And I think there is a fascinating debate that we're seeing about how you integrate Turkey into that. And I think what we're seeing is a positive argument for integrating Turkey and a negative argument for integrating Turkey. The positive argument is this is a country which still has serious military capabilities. I mean, that much is clear. It's the second largest army in NATO. And, you know, it's a force to be reckoned with. The negative argument is that this is a very unreliable ally, and there has been a lot of disquiet in recent years. It's actually interesting if you think over the past 5 years, there's been all sorts of articles saying, should we kick Turkey out of NATO? It isn't reliable. It was flirting too much with Russia. But I think there's a lot of European policymakers who would say, if NATO ceases to exist effectively, or it becomes a rump NATO without the United States. And that is a whole fascinating debate in its own right. What happens if the United States pulls out of NATO? Does it continue? How then does it, reorganize? I think there is a feeling that even if Turkey can't be fully relied upon, that it's that old Johnson argument, isn't it? That you want them in the tent. Even if they can't be reliable, if you kick them out of this European security environment, then you're guaranteeing that they're going to go rogue. Much better to have them in on that debate. So as I say, I think there's a really, really fascinating set of factors that are shaping European decision makers. And I think this works for both sides, for the European Union and for Turkey, as long as they can say that, yeah, of course, we've got really strong relations on security, that Turkey is a European country, and nobody is sort of cutting off that EU membership, which isn't going anywhere, as I say. Then I think it actually works rather nicely for Ankara and for the European countries to work with each other on security for a number of reasons. I think that we will actually see Turkey very, very closely involved in these debates. And we've already seen them involved in London, for example. So I think you're absolutely right. If we're talking about bringing Turkey closer to the European Union, I just don't see that happening. But I think that in many ways, this provides an interesting and valuable get-out clause for both Turkey and Europe to say, we actually really do need to work with each other at the moment.
I think that there's a lot that Turkey can give, but it kind of brings it back to the main point of, well, if NATO is not going to be the primary vehicle of security architecture in Europe, what is? We can imagine NATO with the US in it, but sort of dormant, if you like, and Trump basically, completely removes US funding. The problem is that you still obviously need the United States to be participating in the consultations for anything to do with military action or something like that. So if they're not willing to do that, then you need some kind of new system, and therefore you start to raise questions about to what extent is Turkey or countries that are further afield, not maybe in the core of the EU, if you know what I mean, involved. And I think this comes back to me, the key word I keep thinking of is coordination. Right, Europe has the capacity, we have the human capital, we have the population size, we have the markets, but do we have that interoperability? Do we have that coordination, which is what you're saying, Michael, and I 100% agree with. Who speaks for Europe? I mean, when you think about it, Macron is sort of the de facto guy who likes to take it, but there's a bit of egoism there, right? Macron likes to be the guy who's seen to be being busy. He's been banging the drum of strategic autonomy for the best part of his entire presidency since 2017. So, yeah, I think Europe can do it, but they have to be extremely slick in how they do it. And I know inevitably there's going to be cock-ups, there's going to be hiccups because of just the way that the European Union is constructed. And it comes back to this debate of like how much autonomy for nation states versus the bureaucrats in Brussels. Should Europe become a United States of Europe? That's sort of the thing. And then obviously, just to bring it in for our Canadian audience, but like Canada as well, there's the idea that Canada could join the European market or something, the customs, I think that would be insane. And Mark Carney, I was very curious actually about this, James, particularly as a Brit, but like his reference to we are British with our British heritage or whatever he said a couple of days ago when he was being sworn in as Prime Minister. That's incredibly unusual.
And then switching to French. So anyway, with the French heritage. So, yeah, I mean, it works. I just don't, I mean, and it just shows what weird times we're living in, that, that we are talking about Canada being very integrated into European economics and defense and security. It's these are all things that are going to have to be thought about. And Michael, I think you're very right in the sense of who speaks for Europe. And this is the perennial problem. We've had this for 30 years now. And Europe has, to be fair, it's tried to make a go of rectifying that situation. I mean, you've now got Kaja Kallas, of course, who's High Representative. And so effectively, we can call European foreign minister, but because foreign policy still very much remains a sovereign area of policy making for the EU members, that we can only speak of a European foreign policy where there is full agreement. And again, we're seeing Viktor Orban play all sorts of havoc with this, to the point that I think it's fascinating that now we're hearing much more overt comments about maybe it's time to kick Hungary out of the European Union, that they're becoming so difficult and standing so much against European values.
Can we put that as a question, James? Sorry, I know I'm interrupting occasionally, but I do want to pick up on a particular point because I think it's really worth exploring more. Like, the obvious debate for people who are more Russia aligned or not, whatever, are the European Union, what's happening in Romania, right? What's happening in Romania and this overreach of the European Union is really undemocratic, right? And so to kick Hungary out would be a seismic motion to do, because that would be so undemocratic, and it's a huge, surely that's a bad thing to do, right? Or
that'll be a marketing blow for the EU. That'll be catastrophic for the EU if they kick a country out like that.
All right,
but
so
do they not have
two ways you can come at this? You can look. I think I would tend to agree that it would be catastrophic for the EU to kick Hungary out, simply because then you've set a precedent, and at what point do you put the bar? So if the EU were to pursue this, they would have to do it in a way that really does say this is an extreme case. But by God, does Orban deserve it? Let's be clear. What Orban has been doing, and he is a real troublemaker. He is a troll of the worst sort. He delights in causing havoc, and it's also the height of hypocrisy. The reality is that if Orban really despises the EU as much as he says he does, walk, Brexit, Hungarexit, or whatever you're going to call it, Hungexit. Get out. He could do it tomorrow. There's Article 50 there, but he won't. He's coward. He loves to play it. He loves to play the troll. He loves to go along to conservative meetings in the United States and say the EU is evil. He loves to cause all these problems, but he hasn't got the guts to actually walk away from the European Union. If he had an ounce of integrity, he would do it, but he doesn't. So I don't take Orban seriously in that sense, but I do take him seriously in the sense that he's doing a lot of damage. And I think if there is a single candidate for being booted out of the European Union, that Hungary has got to be it. I mean, all right, Britain was always difficult, but, many Europeans would say that, look, at one level, Britain was an extremely difficult partner, but it also brought a lot to the table. And it was very constructive in other ways. But Hungary, these under Orban, has just anything but. So, as I say, if he was such a hero, he'd submit Article 50 application to leave and start the clock time on 2 years, but he doesn't. So,
well, he doesn't, because he knows economically Hungary is absolutely reliant on the EU,
which makes him even more hypocritical, doesn't it?
I mean, he knows
it. He knows that that he would be, all his patronage networks and everything would collapse overnight without that European money. So he's going around telling Americans EU's terrible and everything like that, but he's pocketing the cash quite happily to do it. Absolute hypocrite. I have nothing but contempt for Orban, I have to say.
Before we go back to you, Michael, for your heated exchange, I just Googled the image of potential EU leaving names after Brexit. There was this funny graphic that I saw, but they don't have one for Hungary because it doesn't work. The best one I can come up with is Hunger out. Hungry out. Or my favorite is Quitterly or Italy. Brexit. Hispan Nope. No land for Poland. Finland. Sweden. Swede departure. Grexit. There's some great ones here, guys. Anyway, sorry, Mike, I'm trying to add some levity to this obviously very critical.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing is,
didn't expect me talking about Hungary leaving, but
Hungary is not going to leave. And we also have to remember again that in democracies, and yes, some people might find this hard to believe. But yes, what is that? Oh, check out. Yes, that's.
Hung out is hung
well,
out. That's
well
a bit
played.
weird. That's a bit sexual, to be honest with you. Sorry.
Hung out is good. I like that one,
Mr. K. Well, well done. Props to you on that one.
Yeah. So, I mean, as much as some people still need to be reminded, is that Hungary still is a democracy, which means that Orban is not there forever. In the same way that any of the, I was going to go back to this about thinking of NATO sans America, and I don't think that Europe's leaders are ready yet to fully cut the cord, pull the plug on the United States, because for them, I could be wrong here, but they see Trump as a 4-year hiccup in which he's out in 4 years, and we bring back in a run-of-the-mill Democrat, whatever it happens to be, or maybe a non-Trump Republican, and we're back to normal, right? We are back to normal. Happy days are here again, and we will resume the transatlantic alliance. That's, of course, predicated on whether Trump is just a 4-year hiccup, or whether Trump is paving the way for a Vance term or a Rubio term or something like that. We will not really be able to discern whether the relationship between the United States and Europe is truly broken for another couple of years. And I think that is largely because of Europe's hesitancy to throw the U.S. out immediately, simply knowing that Trump could very well just be a blip. So when we talk about, and this is the thing with democracies, is that we tend to think that the current elected head of state represents the entire country, right? So, Turkey's, geopolitics is largely predicated on Erdogan. And, Erdogan is not young anymore. And his time in office is numbered. I don't see anyone within the AK party that could succeed him unless the opposition just fails to muster a credible candidate. When it comes to the UK, leadership and policy changes by new government that comes in. When it comes to Germany, we haven't formed a new government yet, but I'm fairly certain that a grand coalition, once we get all the votes in, is going to continue Germany's policy from Scholz to Merz. I mean, no one's going to allow AfD anywhere near control of the Bundestag. So my point here, my point with all of this is that, Orban has certainly shaped Hungary's position within the EU for the last, 15 years. He's been in power since 2010. He can say that, the EU is bad, but he's never going to leave the EU. Why? Because he sees himself as some kind of champion for conservative Europe, alternative Europe, old Europe, right? Not the borders are fluid and migrants are welcome, but that Europe, as the EU, is defined by 27 members with borders and flags and languages and cultures that all form part of the larger European community of nations. So this is not me defending him, but this is just me saying that his understanding of the EU is sort of pivoting in towards much more of an illiberal, populist understanding of Europe, which is being taken up by people like Robert Fico, Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen, when he is free to, state his own views on Europe, probably Vučić, although Vučić has his hands full at the moment right now. Just so everyone knows, there's about 1 million people that marched through Belgrade yesterday.
Don't mention it. That's going to trigger the Serbians, which will trigger James, and then the entire conversation's derailed. I'm joking, but no, there's a lot going on in Serbia. I was kind of curious to touch upon maybe at the end, but Sorry, Michael, I had to make that quick.
I mean, I haven't met anyone. I mean, I have all of my Serbian colleagues here in Tashkent are absolutely in favor of the protests, of the marches. I mean, it's just a collective. It's a collective display of people who have had enough of Vučić for now, another 15 years as well, roughly the same amount of time.
Yeah, no, I think that the situation with Orban is quite fascinating. He's such an illustration of, political ideology in motion, if that makes sense, right? He is it's an illiberal democracy. He's such a blueprint of etching away power, centralizing it around yourself, quashing any sort of notion of opposition, politicizing judicial systems, all this sort of stuff. It's very cleverly done and very gradually done, and he does serve as a good blueprint. But the thing is, though, Michael, we've had conversations about this before on other shows I've had and guests, and one of the points is that we do have a traditional conservative base, right? Look at Friedrich Merz. You can argue whether or not you think he's conservative or not, but he's supposed to represent the center right in what we consider to be the center right. But then you've got this populist right, the sort of the Patriots for Europe group within the European Parliament, and that comprises various different governments from different countries. And Meloni is sort of in there, right? She's part of the Patriots for Europe, but she does support Ukraine. So it's this weird spectrum of people from, center right to sort of increasingly, and then I don't know who you put at the far end in the European category, but sort of, I think it's fascinating where sort of Orban tries to, because he wants to be seen as a traditional conservative, but he plays to the populism quite well. But that just goes against what Friedrich Merz represents, which is, more conventional. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying, but
Merz is a centrist. Merz is right of center. Merz is the CDU. That is Germany's run-of-the-mill right of center.
It's still right wing, though. It's still conservatism.
Right wing. I mean, anything one step away from the center is right wing. I mean, yes. I mean, he's right. I mean, just like saying, Schultz was left wing, although the man would probably run at the sight of, socialist literature. So, I mean, he is SPD. So,
fair enough.
SPDs have a long and ignoble history of disappointing the actual left in Germany. So.
I think the other thing that's quite interesting about that, you mentioned Farage, and there's quite a few people commenting about him as well. I don't know how much you've been following it, guys, but there's obviously a big spat within the Reform Party in the UK at the moment between Nigel Farage, who is whoever kingpin of the party, and a chap called Richard Lowe. And Richard Lowe has adopted really right wing, almost like borderline conspiracy kind of nut shit. And Farage is trying to he's disbarred him, I think, or removed the whip. So, this is an illustration that Farage is right, but he's not willing to go beyond a certain level, right? When he had that back and forth with Musk over Tommy Robinson, the EDL individual, that was interesting because Farage didn't want to rock the boat too much. And so what you've seen now, people claiming, is that Farage is not actually anti the system at all. He's just part of the whole deep state as well. It's funny how people change the framing, and that Rupert Lowe is really the good guy. And Farage, who everyone was idolizing a few months ago, is suddenly common enemy number one. I think it's very strange. I don't know if you...
Well, a party built on atomistic hatred and filled with individuals who are driven by little more than hatred, hate each other. It was always coming. I mean, this is the thing. This is what everyone. I don't know why anyone would be surprised by this. This is the pattern that you see. These aren't people who want to work with other people. Their whole modus vivendi, the way they see this world is not cooperating, getting out of Europe, for example, and refusing the idea that actually this was developing a lot of, and delivering a lot of benefits for Britain. But anyway, look, I mean, seriously, if you think I get upset talking about Serbia, wait till you see what I do. Brexit. No, I'm not doing that today. Let's go back to talking ceasefire. No, really. I mean, that is I don't want to be talking about Farage. Awful individual, charlatan, grifter. But it is. I'm not terribly sorry to see that he's going down
Now, big question. Which one do you despise more, Orban or Farage? Because you went off on both of them.
Is that to me or James?
No, that's to James. That's just more of
I'm
one
not
of those
going to be
spontaneous-
crude. You know.
As is that tea that you're taking?
Cheers. Yes.
It's
Yes.
shit.
No. Not laced with anything. No. Just yeah. No. I mean, look. You know, let's. On a serious note, I mean, you know, we are seeing these trends, and we know it's all troubling. And really, I think, you know, if we're talking about what we're doing about European security, then I think, you know, Orban is a real problem that we have to consider in all sorts of ways. And I think Europe is trying to find ways of dealing with this. And I think that in many ways, what we're seeing at the moment is this talk of kicking Hungary out is very much just ratcheting up the pressure. I mean, what I love is the fact that there is and I think we need to be a little bit careful about what an opposition party in Hungary means. But of course, there is this movement under the wonderfully named Peter Magyar, which, I mean, for anyone who might not realize, is the equivalent of you know, somebody in Britain sort of pitching up as being the opponent of a government, and it's led by a leader called Johnny English. It's you know, it's sort of quite something to see. But, you know, that is, Orban is in trouble. I am going to sort of say, yes, in Serbia, we have had big protests as well. But again, there is that concern of what comes after. And, you know, this has always been sort of the worry that we actually think, and in an era of populism, we get rid of one bad leader and then we just introduce another. So, you know, that's another debate. But certainly, I think, you know, Piotr, on the key thing that we were talking about is, and I think, you know, we should maybe focus a little bit more on is this idea of, you know, where things go with this ceasefire. What are we really talking about in trying to stop this conflict in Ukraine, and the bigger picture of what it means?
Yeah, I mean, from my standpoint, I think I'll frame it this way. So after we had our fiery but I think informative exchange a couple of weeks ago, after the seismic events of the White House, I spent a good couple of hours sort of trying to really ascertain what my viewpoints of this was, in the sense of, you know, Michael, you're more of a realist, James, you're sort of more of an idealist or whatever, but it's too simplistic, right, to frame it like that. And sort of, I remember the term pragmatic idealism came out in the late 20th century, and Condoleezza Rice using it in the 2000s and stuff. And I began to sort of research different framings of things. And it came to be that I'm sort of largely aligned to what they call the strategic idealist, in the sense that I have a long-term picture view, which is that I want Ukraine to be fully sovereign based on its 91 borders. But the reality of the situation is that, well, that's not going to happen right now. And there's another term which was quite relevant, which was principle pragmatist, and sort of that I have my principles that I wish to adhere to, but I'm also pragmatic in how we try and achieve them. And the point I'm making is that, unfortunately, as it stands, Ukraine is in a difficult bind. They do not have the United States' willingness to support them unless it benefits Trump. Putin has taken back Kursk, largely speaking, which is a huge bargaining chip they've lost. They are short on men in a way that the Russians just won't be. I don't know, events around Kursk has certainly galvanized Putin and therefore the Russian population. And therefore that's going to continue to make them want to push. The biggest, I think, tangible change here is Europe. If Europe, again, it kind of comes back to, if they can do stuff, get their act together, then we might be able to begin to see things change. But that's not going to happen tomorrow. And I also, the last point, I'll pass it back to you, Michael, is to what extent do all the rhetoric see followed through with action policy shifts? Because if Europe wants to do stuff, then they're going to need to do even more than they are. You know, Keir Starmer is promising 2.5%, 3% defense spending by 2030. I can't imagine what's going to happen tomorrow morning with Trump and this whole fiasco. So yeah, I think that, and a last point, sorry, but I've had a lot of conversations about the nuclear element in this, and a couple of guests we had from Harvard were emphasizing the fact that as it stands, the French and British do not have the non-strategic capacity to counterbalance Moscow right? They have tactical nuclear warheads, and if one of those is used in a low yield strike somewhere in Eastern Europe, we don't have the equivalent to respond with. And if we respond with strategic ICBMs, well, that is escalation of unprecedented proportion. And well, there you go. So, and also because the British are so entrenched with the Americans, right? We do not have autonomy of our own nuclear systems because we've so embedded them with the Americans. So from a British perspective, it's quite bad. So there's a lot here to disentangle and de-risk from America. Yeah. Anyway, Michael, what do you think?
So, I mean, if this was to happen, and let's just say that we go with Macron's idea of what is it, strategic autonomy that he was talking about, then a couple of things need to be made within this year. And the first decision is, regardless of who's in the White House and regardless of what comes after Trump, Europe was basically doing whatever the United States had said since 1990. Europe was living largely in my country's shadow. And if you don't want that anymore, then you need to make a very painful but very executive decision. And that is, whoever is in the White House, we will either cooperate or we won't, but Europe will have an independent foreign policy. That's the first point. The second is putting together a number of smaller, well, not necessarily smaller, but separate pieces together. You have NATO, you have the EU, and most of the 27 countries in one are part of the other. And at any discussion which talks about the need for the European Union to act with more unity, they constantly talk about more centralization. And, you know, the big thing which some have floated is the EU. Federalize the damn thing. Right? Federalize it. Now you've got much more of a united government. Will that happen? I don't know. Will NATO become somewhat of the military appendage of the EU? Will the EU become the economic wing of NATO? We need to decide. We have so many organizations, so many overlapping sets of leadership, which most of these leaders are not elected. They are not elected by the population. You know, when it comes to NATO, leaders are appointed. When it comes to the EU, you've got the EU Commission, you've got the Council of Ministers. None of these people are appointed. None of them have any kind of electoral accountability. So for a country, for a group of countries that like to say that they are, European Parliament's one thing, that's it.
No, but hold on, Michael. I think, you know, this is a debate that I had with leavers all the time. This Europe is not democratic. Hold on, you know, so on the one hand, they don't want Europe to become a superstate. And the best way of ensuring that Europe doesn't become a superstate is to maintain power in the hands of the members. And the way that you do that is, so you've got the European Parliament, which is the directly elected component of the European Union, and you've got the European Council, which is the overarching, sets the strategic agenda of the European Union, which is where the democratically elected leaders of the member states are represented. And then you've got the Commission, which of course each country appoints, puts a name into the hat. And it's also essentially the political leaning of the Commission is directed by the European parliamentary elections. So I think it's really important to sort of just add a quick corrective on this, that, you know, if, as you say, we want a fully federal European Union, then you're right. But for what most people in Europe want the European Union to be, which is still fundamentally built on the framework of member states, the current setup is the best setup that you can have. Because, you know, people say, well, the European Parliament can't propose legislation, so Europe isn't democratic. Yeah, if you want to put it in terms of a state, you're right, but people don't seem to want it that way. But I mean, I fully accept if you say that it's going down a federal way, or it should go down a federal way, then we need to rethink this. But I think that for what most people in Europe seem to want, which is a supranational, I mean, you know, and we get into how do you describe Europe. I am very much of the view that you describe it as a political community. It's sui generis. It sort of doesn't have a parallel anywhere else. As I say, political community seems to be the best way. if you want to keep it that way, then I think that, so sorry to push back on this, but I do get when people say that European Union isn't democratic. It's very democratic. It's just, it respects that democracy is still essentially lies in the member states rather than as a single super state.
Oh, I didn't say that the EU wasn't democratic. I didn't say that the EU wasn't democratic. The EU files.
Well, you said unelected, which is to all the people in the comments or listening to this who are reform voters or whatever. That's dog whistle stuff.
Okay,
so maybe I'm just coming at it from a UK perspective.
Not elected. Josep Borrell was not elected. They were not elected by the people. They speak on behalf of the entire community. I mean, if you want to elect these individuals, then that's one thing, but they're not. They're appointed.
No, but Borrell could only speak on behalf of the European Union if all the member states acceded to a particular foreign policy decision. So you had the 27 members, the duly elected leaders of the 27 members saying, we all sign up to a foreign policy position. Mr. Borrell or Ms. Callas, who is now the High Representative, please go off and communicate that. So if anyone wants to know, you are now empowered to do that. But if they don't speak in that single terms, she isn't empowered to do that. And I think it's really, really important. And we hear this unelected. But, I come from a country where, I have a head of state who's unelected. I have a permanent secretary, cabinet secretary who's unelected, is appointed. The speaker of that, there's an entire upper chamber of parliament that is completely unelected. In that sense, if we're to talk about, where democracy, we can talk about, I think most member states, or certainly, Britain as a former member state, there's far fewer people who actually are elected than in Europe in many ways.
And yet at the same time, the big thing is who is going to speak on behalf of this 27-member organization in the future. You guys can figure that out. All right, you guys can figure that one out.
The Americans, okay? You can. It's not my problem.
Trust me, I got enough shit to worry about in my own country here, but still, I got enough stuff to worry about.
But yeah, I was going
to say is that I would say what I had said before is that the EU may very well wait for Trump to leave after 4 years and hope for a reset. The question that you had asked, Piotr, in terms of where is Europe going? James is very much adamant about Europe is still very relevant. It still has a very important voice in the world. Sure, fine. In that regard, then make the decision now to figure out where you're going to be in 2 years, in 4 years, in 5 years for a true independent European entity, a voice on the world stage. And don't wait for the United States to come back and invite you back.
Yeah, I think this comes down to willingness and capacity to do it, right? We have the potential in Europe to do it. I'm a Europeanist. I believe in Europe. I always have. Yeah. I'm firmly critical of its complacency and tardiness in being over-reliant, not just on American security assurances, but Chinese cheap markets and Europe and Russian energy. Right. And that's not me saying that. That's Josep Borrell, the former foreign secretary or whatever minister for the EU at a delegation dinner a couple of years ago. Right. I'm paraphrasing it. But the point is that Europe needs to get itself in gear, and we can be another pole. We can be another pole in this multipolar or multiplexity world, to quote the paper from the Munich Security Conference of last month. Right. Europe can do it. The problem is coordination, and I think we need to have a clear illustration of just how much integration we want to go to. I'm not a all-out Europeanist in the sense of I believe in the United States of Europe. I love Europe for the fact that we have different states with cultures and communities and such. But the problem is, if you don't get that balance right, then you have a repeat of the sovereign debt crisis sort of stuff from 10, 12 years ago, where you've got Germany needing one set of policies, but Greece needing another set of policies, but you've got a central bank that is trying to do, one form of monetary supply versus multiple government fiscal policies. So, it's difficult to see how that can happen. Michael, you're the one who's more skeptical of this sort of stuff. and I'm not asking you to have the answer, but if you could prescribe some improvements for Europe, what would they be?
What would I improve for Europe? Hard to say. I always, when I teach my class on the European Union and we come to one of those moments in history where they were presented with some internal problem, there's always this idea of, just federalize. And I'm not advocating that. I'm not advocating for a United States of Europe. But what I can say right now is a great way for Europe to show its readiness and determination to take charge, not even in Ukraine, but within Europe itself. Two issues right now can be easily addressed: Kosovo and Bosnia. Now, Bosnia is easier because it's a sovereign state. But internally, as we all know, yes, I know it all comes back to the Balkans, but Bosnia is a mess internally. And when it comes to Kosovo, we are waiting for 10 years for somebody in Pristina to finally ratify the Brussels Agreement and implement ZSO, which would go a real long way in creating stability within this disputed territory. And yet, this just does not seem to happen. And if people are still waiting on Trump or Richard Grenell or Donald Trump Jr. or, heaven help us, Elon is going to go there and solve the Kosovo issue, then it's just another example of Europe just literally waiting for my country to handle stuff in your backyard.
All right, James.
Fair dues.
What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not.
You don't think it's about the Balkans? I think you're overblowing the Balkans.
No, I'm not doing Balkans, Michael. Point well taken, though. Yeah, no, I agree. I think you're absolutely right. This is an issue that should have been wrapped up a long time ago. But I think, certainly as somebody who's very pro-European, bitterly regrets Britain's decision to leave. And, as I said in last live stream, I think, we are now seeing all sorts of effects that are coming out of that, but not least of all this strategic. I think that, this really is a moment then that Europe needs to be thinking very clearly about what it's going to do. And I think one of the things that really is important in all of this, and Piotr, you mentioned about the ceasefire that's been talked about and Russia making a demand that there's no Europeans on the ground. I just cannot see how an agreement is going to operate without Europeans on the ground. It's as simple as that. It will not. That agreement will not be worth the paper it's written upon unless there is some sort of security guarantee that comes from Europe that says to Putin, listen, if you want to kick off again, then it's going to be something much more serious. And I know that you're going to have all the sort of the pro-Russian voices saying, oh yeah, we can handle the Europeans and everything like that. No. I think we would be talking about a very, very different conflict, and it would then be all in on helping Ukraine if European troops were to find themselves in harm's way because Russia's decided it wants to start again. And with no disrespect to the wonderful work that's done by peacekeeping countries, Bangladesh and places like that, which have a very, very honourable tradition of peacekeeping. This is not a normal peacekeeping situation. This is something where I think it could be. It could kick off again very, very easily, and I think you would have to. You could only provide the Ukraine with the safeguards it needs by having European forces in there. So I think Europe is going to have to be a lot more serious about this, and which countries can provide it and at what levels. And this comes back to the point that the US has made about Europe cutting back on its defense expenditure. Troop numbers are right down. I mean, the UK army is at the lowest ever level. And that really does, there will be a lot of talk about how do you remedy that. We know that many countries are having real problems with recruitment. There are actually a surprising number of European countries that maintain conscription. But if, it's one thing having sort of, young men, invariably young men, signing up at 18 and doing 6 months, in a local military barracks or to another part of the country. It's something very different when you're saying to them, right, okay, gear up, get some training, and then you're going to be sitting on the front line in, a ceasefire line, but nevertheless a front line in Ukraine. So, it will spark the real debate. And I think that will really test the mettle of European policymakers when they're talking about European security, that they will have to think very, very seriously about what this means in the round. It's not just about sort of coming up with a nuclear umbrella, which France has obviously put forward. And we've seen Donald Tusk, for example, making very interesting comments about Poland. I think we have to be clear, he's not, from what I can tell, proposing that Poland develops its own nuclear capabilities, but certainly talking very clearly about Poland perhaps sort of stationing French nuclear weapons. There could be the discussion about what Britain does, and Britain is sort of very entangled with the United States. So these are the really serious debates which European policymakers are going to be having to think about very, very seriously at the moment, from the very immediate sense that if this ceasefire goes through, how are you going to provide the troops necessary? And it will be a large number that are needed, right through to how do you rearm? How do you deal with the nuclear umbrella? It's part would say it's a fascinating time, but it's also a deeply worrying time.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it is a deeply worrying time, but I do believe in Europe, and I think that they can do it, and I hope that they can do it. God, goodness me, there's so many more things we could talk about, right?
Yes.
I know, James, you wanted to discuss the military aspects in depth, so I thought we could go into that. Really interesting. I'm joking, everybody. James doesn't like military matters or discussing military.
Which is rather ironic, because my first job out of university for 2 years was working at a place called the Royal United Services Institute, which is probably the world's leading sort of military studies think tank in the world. And I learned to recognize all the ranks of the armed forces and things like that. I also went to a military school, but I am not a bombs, tank, gun sort of counting type of person. I've always been much more on the diplomatic side. So that's why I don't talk about front lines and, the X783 weapons system is going to do this and that. Not my thing. And I don't claim to do it or make.
Yeah, I think it's quite simple, in my opinion. I think there's a lot of people who are annoyed by the fact that Europe is no longer just sort of bucking at the heel of the United States. Obviously, I want to see the war end, but as I made clear in a post earlier, Europe doesn't support war. They support the defense of a sovereign state that is on the receiving end of might makes right and hard power coercion, right? This isn't about sort of warmongering. It's about a simple standing up for certain principles. And a lot of people who are anti that just don't like the fact that the Europeans are not willing to well, as I said, lie down and just take it. And I think that it's rather amusing to see people freak out and get angry over the fact that it's no longer just about America being the warmongers. Oh, it's just those Europeans again. Oh, okay, the Europeans that apparently don't exist or don't have a say. Suddenly, yet you're saying that they're such a threat. So which is it, guys? The Europeans are just passive people that the Russians are going to overlook, or they're so important, but they are important because they're triggering in Moscow. Those two things are inconsistent with one another. I think it's going to be, we've got the defense ministers meeting on Thursday, where we're going to see, I think, continued discussions around this. I mean, ultimately, Putin doesn't have a say what happens in Ukraine, in the sense of like, if Europeans want to have troops put there, or they're going to, and the Ukrainians agree with that, what's Putin going to do? He's going to send more forces to try and prevent them from doing that. I don't think he has that military capacity at the moment. The Russian economy is at it's overheating, and the military forces are kind of overstretched. So I don't really see what's Trump going to do? Is he going to prevent the Europeans from putting troops on the ground? What do you think, Michael?
I don't know how he's going to do that, unless he just threatens to either say that the United States will not defend certain countries in NATO if they are attacked, or threaten to pull out of NATO. I would be very surprised if Trump actually pulls out of NATO. I mean, you don't give up that bargaining chip. I mean, that is a major card to play. We've seen Trump, defund U.S. aid and a whole bunch of other things around the world, which, greatly undermines our soft power capabilities. I honestly don't know. There are so many things that are out, on the table at this point, where, and I was listening to James before and talk about we're once again at that hour of Europe, and will they kind of, live up to the challenge, or will they back down? I mean, I absolutely agree with him. We may not see eye to eye on the principles, but he is absolutely correct on this. And it fits to what I was saying before about how my best recommendation for Europe is to just accept the reality that the partnership with the United States is not what it once was, and it is in Europe's best interest to think of a long-term strategy, a 3, 5, and 10-year plan for developing an autonomous foreign policy, economic policy, military policy, and then see where we are from there. That would give Europe more leverage over Ukraine. Right now, it's rhetoric over applicability, and I think that Moscow knows this. So if the war in Ukraine continues, even at a lower level, or let's just say that we get to what no one officially wants, but in my opinion, everyone secretly is kind of hoping for, and that's a frozen conflict. Because a frozen conflict is just that. I mean, whether it's Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Kosovo, any of these things, these parastates, right? These are frozen conflicts. Officially, all sides condemn the frozen conflict. They don't want it, right? They want a settlement. They want an end to this conflict. They want to mitigate the security dilemma that comes with a frozen conflict. And in reality, they love frozen conflicts because it keeps your foot in the door. It keeps you still holding on to your leverage in an area in which you think, I can't gain leverage now over my opponent, but down the road I can. The future may hold where something happens, some unforeseen thing happens. Who comes after Putin? We have absolutely no idea. Will Russia still have the same type of organization? That's a big issue. Just like we were talking before with Turkey. Who comes after Erdogan? That's a big issue. Serbia holding on to something over Kosovo, Albanians holding something up. What will happen, right? Serbs are getting kind of happy that Trump is in office. I don't think he's going to do them any favors, but there's always this idea. And if Ukraine remains this frozen conflict like Transnistria is, no one wants it, but this might be a way for Kiev to say somewhere down the road, we might have a better advantage at taking back our territories. We'll never recognize them. We will never recognize the loss of these territories. Serbia does not recognize the loss of Kosovo, but you hold on to your cards and you wait for a possible better opportunity down the road. We talk again, we condemn frozen conflicts. We don't want frozen conflicts, but there's a strategic use for them.
Michael, can I just ask, because I mean, you clearly have a good ear to the ground of what people in Russia are saying, and to give a plug obviously to your channel and things, you do an amazing job of actually translating major policy speeches and making those available. I mean, essentially what we're talking about with the ceasefire would be something that, certainly as I would see it, is that you turn this into a frozen conflict, and Ukraine would say, listen, we need to have the security guarantees. I think it will have a lot of backup from European countries. How does Putin sell an agreement like that? That doesn't allow for the legitimization, let alone the legalization of the conquest of those eastern territories? And I just cannot see that happening. And for anyone who regularly watches us knows why I think that would be absolutely disastrous for international peace and security if you did see any move to try and legalize Russia's annexation of those territories. I think you're absolutely right. A frozen conflict makes sense. But how does Putin then sell that?
I mean, he sells it in the same way that he sold the formal annexation of those territories about 2 years ago, where he signed off on all 4 of these oblasts in some ceremony in the Kremlin. As far as Russia's concerned, this is a fait accompli. Whether the world recognizes it or not is inconsequential, because, de facto over de jure, right? We de facto control Crimea. We de facto control Mariupol. I mean, what are you going to do about that? The putting my ear to the ground, I can tell you this, that the minute that there was the prospects of a ceasefire, the minute that there was the prospects of Trump and Putin talking about ending this conflict, many Russians began the move back home. They want to go back home. They want this war to end. Ordinary Russians, like everyone else, just simply wants to go back to whatever life that they were having beforehand. So however way that he sells it, in whatever it ends up being, because I am very much convinced that he will not get his maximalist demands. I mean, that much is certain. I mean, he is asking for the full annexation of territory in Ukraine that the Russian forces still do not control. They do not control Kherson. They do not control Zaporozhye. So best case scenario is a frozen conflict along the front lines, which may explain why they are trying as much as possible to wrap this whole thing up in Kursk. So Sudzha was taken a couple of days ago, and for now it's more of a mopping up campaign. So by the time
the Ukrainians don't have anything left. They've done a tactical withdrawal, a tactical displacement of Kirks. You can see on those.
So they lost that bargaining chip, right?
No, they've lost Kirks. There's no ambiguity around that. They withdrew, largely speaking. I mean, I've seen countless videos of artillery stations with loads of munitions just left around. It reminds me of sort of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the amount of equipment that's just been abandoned by the Ukrainian forces. So that's not without question. I think that's the biggest drawback now, and the Ukrainians are going to be on the back foot even more. This is why, sort of, quite simply, I think the Ukrainians should consider some degree of cessation of hostilities, simply because they can bolster their security lines, they can bolster their supply links with the Europeans, and people are getting frustrated that sort of this is going to cause escalation with the Russians. But the point is, the Kremlin doesn't have much of a say, and it's either sort of Putin wants everything, and because he's not going to get everything, and the Europeans are being that fly in the ointment point I made before, they are within their rights to make their own choices outside of what the Americans would prefer to happen and the Russians prefer to happen. And I don't see that as a provocation. I see that as upholding basic international principles. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think we're in for a bit of a, what's the expression in English? A sticky wicket. And we're going to see this we'll reconvene and talk about the latest points ongoing, I guess. But what did you guys? I don't know if you guys wanted to end on anything specific. Maybe because we've been going. There's so much to talk about, right?
I think we've covered everything.
I mean, it's been wide-ranging. Right. I mean, as you said, there's just so many things. Yeah, I think we've covered everything that we can reasonably cover, and a few other things. I mean, discussion about Armenia and Hungary,
and Georgia,
and Georgia,
yeah,
and a little bit of Trump, not Trump, Farage.
Yeah, well, you guys should come. We should get you to London at some point and do this in person. I found a nice recording studio. Finally, everybody. So we'll be doing more things in person. Ironically, I went to an event at Russia on Friday, James, which was very interesting.
Oh, right.
About nuclear.
How is the old place? It's
beautiful, as delightful as ever. Walking down Whitehall next to the
no, it was that my morning commute walking down Whitehall was fascinating, and it was No, I spent two great years working at Russia.
Oh, very interesting.
Started career out there. Yeah.
Well, I want to give exciting stuff. Well, I want to give a huge shout out to these guys. That was bad English. I want to give a huge shout out to these gentlemen, guys. Most of you watching are, I think, from James's channel, but do check out Michael's stuff. He does incredible stuff. And if you appreciate me trying to be a bit more measured in this conversation, then I don't know, check out my channel. We're doing them together. And I guess we'll reconvene in a week. Try to make sense of what's going on in this week. Hopefully, there'll be less to talk about, or maybe in a more positive sense. But any final thoughts? Any shout outs?
Well, I remember just 2 weeks ago, before I was leaving, James, you had recommended that I try Shut Up, the restaurant in.
Yes, did you?
Of course I did. It was fantastic. The food in Armenia is phenomenal. There was not a bad restaurant that I was in. It was great.
Georgia gets all the love, but I do say to people, and that's not doing Georgia down. The food in Georgia is wonderul.
It's excellent.
But Armenia is no slouch on that. It really it's also absolutely excellent. And nice shout out to Sherep. I hope it's recognized next time I'm in Yerevan.
Yeah, so shut up old Yerevan Tavern and a couple of other places. I was there. Yerevan, I was amazed. I was shocked. I was actually quite pleased at how orderly and it was a very symmetrical city, right? I mean, there's lots of parts of Armenia that are just abandoned. It's just very, very poor, very, very rural. And then you hit Yerevan and you're like, I could absolutely spend, a month or two here.
Oh, Yerevan's a lovely place. No, I'm very, very fond of Yerevan, and it's and not necessarily the easiest place to get to, especially from Western Europe. The flights have a nasty habit of arriving at a very bad time at night and departing at a very bad time of night.
Yeah.
But really well worth it. And it's sort of place you could do if you take an extra couple of days to recover, a city break. So absolutely. So Piotr, you said you'd not made it up. So please see Yerevan. And
all right, we'll all convene in Yerevan then. I think that's
there we
go.
go.
We'll do this in person. I'm also going to start a new channel, everybody. I'm really excited to announce that I'm going to be starting a new channel, the James E. Michael Piotr Travel Show, where we go on, we're the Top Gear guys of geopolitics.
Two liberals and a Marxist travel.
Two liberals and a Marxist go traveling.
Right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. All right. See you later, guys.
Thanks a lot. Bye.